Hello Techlore community and other mobile ROM enthusiasts. I published a review of CalyxOS not too long ago and expressed the drastic differences I felt using the phone versus GrapheneOS. Despite showing video evidence with clear disclaimers and many other people in our communities finding the same thing, many didn't like what was said. And sure, it wasn't very professional testing. The point of the video wasn't a direct comparison, but rather my thoughts during the review of the ROM. Consider those criticisms the catalyst which created this video. Now, this is kind of hell because the Graphene dev says the app opening times are just a minor difference, which justifies the security improvements of Graphene, but he also justifies most problems with Graphene by blaming the user, including its limited app compatibility, which exists. There's data for it. We have a project proving that. Another dev said that Graphene is actually faster than stock Android and CalyxOS by up to 60% and supplied no evidence or data to back this claim up. No one has just straight up offered up data to help settle concerns. This video took a couple months to complete and it will give raw data into battery performance, raw benchmark performance, and real-world performance between each ROM, all tested on the Pixel 3a. To make things interesting, I also did tests with stock Android, which should serve as a control, and I threw in an iPhone SE, which is a phone in the same price range and not a bad alternative to a custom ROM setup. There are some things iOS does for your privacy and security that are still unmatched by Graphene, and Graphene does some other things better. I'll cover all of this broader stuff at the end. I also want to mention that this is the Pixel 3a, which is running on weaker hardware, so this may not be applicable to higher end devices, though it should likely still be an indicator of what you might see on other phones. Not only will you get raw data today, but I will give you my analysis on each test to add needed context for why certain things happen, as well as limitations in each benchmark. I'm not on any side here. I think both Calyx and Graphene are great projects which serve different needs, but I also value the truth and you picking the right ROM, and that's what I hope to give you today. Here are some timestamps for each section. I recommend watching all of it for a full picture, as even though the end does summarize things, the context is very important. Let's begin with synthetic CPU benchmarks. Each test for each device was run 3 times, and the values you see on the screen are the averages between the tests. These are all on the Pixel 3a, each ROM running Android 10. Our first benchmark will be Geekbench 5 single core. Stock Android and CalyxOS had the exact same score, and GrapheneOS fell behind by about 10%. And here's the iPhone SE. Our Geekbench CPU multicore saw about a 1% drop-off on CalyxOS and a 24% drop-off on GrapheneOS. And here's the iPhone SE. So off the bat, things don't look great for GrapheneOS, but this is just a synthetic benchmark and only one at that. Regardless, it is obvious there was already some impact on performance based on this benchmark. The other elephant in the room is the iPhone just blew everything out of the water, and just a quick spoiler, the rest of the video will mostly be like that. The next benchmark is PCMark Work 2.0, which is designed to emulate some productivity real-world tasks like opening spreadsheets, basic video encoding, document editing, web browsing, and more. Despite claiming to offer a real-world experience, it still is synthetic, and we will look at it as a synthetic benchmark. Stock Android scored the highest, followed by CalyxOS, which had about a 2% drop from stock, and GrapheneOS had about a 6.5% drop from stock. Things are much more even here than Geekbench, which makes sense considering this is more of a real-world test. Regardless, there was still a measurable hit on both Calyx and Graphene much larger. Unfortunately, this benchmark isn't on the iPhone, so we just have to imagine the iPhone blowing everything else out of the water. Let's go into some GPU benchmarks. Geekbench 5 GPU compute scored the best on GrapheneOS, stock Android scored 0.5% lower, and CalyxOS scored about 1% lower than Graphene. The iPhone scored about 10 times better. This is the first test where Graphene was victorious, though not 60%, and sadly not much more than 1%. Regardless, this is a good sign that the GPU performance seems to be unaffected, if not slightly improved. The next GPU benchmark was 3DMark Slingshot, and this kind of flipped some things on its head. CalyxOS scored the highest here, but I'm talking 4 points in the scheme of thousands, so we can declare Calyx and stock to be a tie. GrapheneOS came about 6% behind those two. The iPhone scored over twice as well. That is all of the synthetic benchmarks that were run. With the exception of the Geekbench CPU benchmark, GrapheneOS held its ground, but had a measurable hit in most benchmarks. I think it's safe to say that Calyx and stock had near identical performance, and Graphene mostly fell behind. These are synthetic benchmarks though, that are pushing things in a way that maybe aren't reflective of the real world, so again, keep that in mind. My last comment here is that no matter what benchmark I ran, the Pixel never once heated up. I mean, never. Not to mention I never saw any battery drain as the benchmark was running. On the other hand, the iPhone actually had to take breaks between benchmarks because I was getting much lower scores running the benchmarks back to back due to heat. Additionally, I could watch the battery drop on the iPhone as the benchmark was running. I think overall, it's obvious the Pixels are meant to be highly efficient phones, and the iPhone probably matches that efficiency, but also has the capability to kick some ass in benchmarks and high-performance tasks. Personally, I don't use my phone for anything really, so I actually like that my Pixel is total weak sauce, but I 100% understand that is not a common thing to enjoy. I don't think people realize how impressive Apple's mobile chips are. This $400 iPhone is likely outperforming almost every laptop on the market and even most desktops in these raw benchmarks. Look it up, don't take my word for it. You're getting a hell of a lot of performance for a $400 phone. We'll talk about this a lot more down the road. The next test was some browser benchmarks. These are likewise synthetic, so make sure to keep that in mind. Like last time, each test was run 3 times on each ROM, and the values you see are averages. For this section, I used the default browser on each ROM. For stock Android, that's Chrome. For CalyxOS, it's Chromium, the open source version of Chrome. And for Graphene, it's Vanadium, a hardened version of Chromium with security and privacy improvements. The first thing I want to mention was I originally accidentally tested stock Android using Chrome before updating the browser, and there was a noticeable difference. I'm talking 5 to 10% in browser performance between the outdated and the updated version. So regardless of what ROM you pick, keep your apps up to date. If not for security, then do it for performance. After updating, I reran the tests. Let's get into the actual numbers. Jetstream 2 combines countless mini benchmarks and gives you a final score. Stock with Chrome scored the highest, followed by Graphene's Vanadium, which scored about 5% lower, and Calyx on Chromium fell just behind GrapheneOS. The iPhone with Safari crushed everything. MotionMark is another web benchmark which focuses on graphics performance. Stock Android with Chrome scored the highest, followed by CalyxOS with Chromium that fell 12% behind, and Graphene with Vanadium fell a whopping 46% behind, scoring about half of what stock with Chrome scored. The iPhone scored about 5 times better than stock with Chrome and almost 10 times better than Graphene with Vanadium. The final browser benchmark is speedometer. Stock Android again was victorious, CalyxOS fell behind by 4%, and Graphene fell behind stock by about 16%. The iPhone, as expected, blew it all out of the water. Now you might be thinking, were these differences attributed to the browser or the ROM? The previous synthetic benchmarks proved that Graphene is generally slower, but the MotionMark test showed half the performance, greater than anything else we saw in the first benchmark section. So what caused this? I think the answer is both the ROM and the browser, because I installed Chrome on GrapheneOS, reran the benchmarks, and Chrome on Graphene actually got the highest score on speedometer, the second highest score with Jetstream 2, and it still was last place in MotionMark, but by nowhere near as much. Instead of a 46% fall to stock Android, it was 22%. So the browser you choose does make an impact. If you're using the same browser on each ROM, the differences will be much more minimal, though they will likely still exist due to the performance differences found on a system-wide level. At this point, the synthetic benchmarks are over, and I would like to confirm that there were a total of 2 tests where Graphene scored higher, and each of these was less than a 1% improvement. So I asked the individual who made the claim that Graphene is 60% faster to please supply the data, where and when this takes place, as I could not recreate it, and neither will the real-world benchmarks. The last note again is the $400 iPhone SE grossly outperformed especially the Pixel, but even my brand new MacBook Pro, which is over $3,000, as well as my desktop, which is also over $3,000 and has an i7-7820X overclocked to 4.6 GHz. The CPU itself is worth more than the entire iPhone. A spoiler, my overall message for the iPhone is its value is absolutely unbeatable, and I'll cover why that is at the end, where I give a full summary. And before you scream in the comments I'm being a fanboy, I'm talking about value, not open source, not privacy, not anything. I'm just talking the value of the phone, and I'd love to see you Apple haters prove me wrong, because I am an Apple hater, just not a dumb one. This is it, people. Real world performance. This is where we evaluate normal usage of the phone and see if there are any differences day to day. This was a big point of debate in our Calyx review since the hardening of graphene most impacts first-time app openings, which was the only thing we really talked about. So we will properly test those app openings, but also some more real-world things outside of that, like switching user accounts, opening widgets, accessing the volume rocker, holding on a toggle to open the settings app, and accessing the phone dialer. Aside from this, I did some file tests, which include archiving and unarchiving a file, as well as copying the file between two internal directories. For the record, I went into this expecting none of the file transfers to make a difference, but I just did it to be thorough. Lastly, I opened up PPSSPP for some gaming to see if there was any substantial difference in gaming performance. Let's start with the controversial app opening times. Stock Android and CalyxOS had the same exact times, so you can use them interchangeably, and that's what the benchmarks will show from here on out. If you care, I did 2 tests on stock Android, one with the stock animation speed set to 1x, and the other one, the animation speed was modified in the developer options to 0.5x. And this actually does impact some of the times, so if you want a snappier phone, it doesn't just feel faster with a better animation speed, it actually is faster. All of the benchmarks you're going to see in the rest of the section on Graphene and Calyx are done at 0.5x speed, which you can enable in the developer options, and in my honest opinion, should be the default. It's much snappier. For our purposes, this is just a comparison and it shouldn't really impact that as long as both ROMs are set to 0.5x, which they are. So let's get into it. For Graphene, you're going to see an entire extra second to open the calculator app, a second and a half to load Aurora, and another second and a half to load F-Droid. First, this is massive. 1 second doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're casually using something and there's an entire second delay, that's huge. Now, here's where things get interesting. These are numbers I got from the Calyx review a couple months ago, back when Graphene was on Android 10. I reran these tests with Android 11, which is what Graphene runs on now, and sure enough, there are some pretty big improvements. Pretty much universally, with the exception of Slide, Graphene universally adds about half a second to CalyxOS, which is a huge improvement over the Android 10 numbers. I don't know if this is an unintentional improvement that came along with Android 11, or if it was purposefully improved by Graphene developers. If the latter, I'd be very concerned with the lack of transparency about this, because it shows they made under-the-hood changes knowing it was a serious enough problem that needed improvement, while publicly going out and telling people it wasn't a big deal and the security gains were worth it. Again, we'll talk more about this later towards the end. And just in case you were still wondering, the iPhone just killed everything. Most apps on the iPhone load during the opening animation, so the only delay is the animation on the iPhone. It's pretty darn impressive. The next test was user switching. Android allows multiple user accounts, and this can take a couple seconds to switch over to a new user. These were all done on the newest Graphene running Android 11. You're seeing a 12% difference, or about 0.3 seconds. Not too major, especially for something you're likely not doing very often. Next up was a widget. I used the clock widget, which if you tap, opens the clock app. GrapheneOS took 1.27 seconds and CalyxOS took 0.6 seconds. This takes over twice as long to open on Graphene. Next is the volume rocker. For you unlucky iOS users who have a volume situation more complicated than a frickin' Rubik's Cube, Android is actually intelligent and allows you to change volume of each type of ringtone in the rocker. Who would have thought? On Graphene, clicking the volume button to get all the values to display took a mind-blowing 2.67 seconds. CalyxOS did it in half a second, so this was over a 2-second difference. Next is toggles. If you hold on some toggles in the notification area, it will open the corresponding settings page. For this test, I used the hotspot toggle. CalyxOS took 0.9 seconds from the time I started holding on the button to finish loading the settings page, and GrapheneOS took 1.37 seconds. The next test was the phone dialer. You have to click the dialer button inside the phone app to open the dialer, and this represents opening an internal menu within an already open application. And sure enough, they were exactly the same at 0.83 seconds, telling us that likely in most apps that are already open, you shouldn't see a drawback in just using their internal menus. For file transfers, as expected, there wasn't a big difference. Technically speaking, Calyx and stock were about tied and just a tad faster than Graphene, with the exception of the file copy, which Graphene actually won, but I'd really just consider this all a tie. I think these are all within a margin of error. The iPhone, though, as you can imagine, also kills in the storage game. In fact, the file copy just instantly worked. I had to do some troubleshooting to verify if iOS was truly copying the file and not using some software trick to make it look like it copied the file and finished in the background. Nope, it just transferred instantly, as if you clicked a button, whereas the Pixel took 15 seconds. The very last thing I did to evaluate real-world performance was loading up Birth by Sleep, the best Kingdom Hearts game, into PPSSPP, a PSP emulator. I played around with the resolution settings on both, and there was no significant difference. The game capped at around 5 to 6x upscale with a 3x texture upscale. Anything higher and you were looking at under 30 FPS and a choppiness at about the same crappiness across both ROMs. And that wraps up the real-world testing. I think the general consensus is despite the improvements in Graphene on Android 11, which are very impressive, it still is noticeably slower when navigating the operating system. Opening apps, interacting with widgets, the volume rocker, toggles, and everything else that we looked at was slower. All of this slowdown on Graphene makes for an overall clunkier experience. I daily drove Graphene for 8 months and I didn't notice a single thing. You get used to it. But once I went over to Calyx, you realize, oh, wow, that's actually a lot faster. Then it's kind of hard to go back and use Graphene again. I would like to challenge the individual, you know who you are, who claimed Graphene is 60% faster in some tasks because I couldn't make it happen in anything. I also am very curious as to where the Graphene developer gets his estimates for app opening times, as even with the improvements in Android 11, there was normally half a second of delay, and this is constantly being downplayed as being less than that, as well as not a noticeable problem. Now, you might not give a damn about this. I mean, I frankly don't, and that's totally understandable. Again, I'm going to offer a broader analysis at the end, but for strictly evaluating speed here, that's the whole point of this section. This is the truth up until this point. We'll talk about its larger implications or lack of later, as well as how these benchmarks play into the security, privacy, and compatibility of each ROM. The very last test was the battery test, which for me was the most surprising, hands down. My disclaimer in advance, these tests are not directly evaluating idle battery life. So if you leave your phone off for 8 hours, that would be idling. The tests I ran hint at idling, and my takeaway is any differences you see in my testing will impact idling likely to a greater degree. The reason for this is each ROM was set up exactly the same with very controlled changes. The battery test is done with PCMark Work 2.0, which actually runs the same benchmark we used earlier from 80% to 20% battery, where it uses the data from that 60% to give you the total amount of time the phone would have lasted from 100 to 0. In other words, the times you're going to see for these results are done with the benchmark running and the screen on, which is why idling is not directly accommodated for. However, I'm confident that the factors and the controls are kept consistent enough to tell us which ROM would do better idling. Let's dive into the benchmarks. Stock Android, we have a real-world test and a max test. Real World enables Wi-Fi, Bluetooth keeps the phone at 50% brightness, installs Signal, Briar, and Telegram, all of which are syncing in the background through Google Play services, and I am logged in to a Google account. The max test is done on airplane mode at also 50% brightness and no background tasks or a Google account. The real world was 11.43 hours and the max was 12.48 hours. About an hour difference, which is pretty massive considering the background tasks are likely not the major contributors to this power loss during a benchmark. I think that hour can easily turn into hours when we're talking about idling differences where the phone is doing absolutely nothing outside the background tasks. So yes, airplane mode and disabling background syncing makes a big difference on battery life, and I'm a huge advocate for leaving your phone on airplane mode overnight or just switching it off altogether. CalyxOS is up next, and I had to do 4 benchmarks for CalyxOS, one with microG and one without microG. a reminder that CalyxOS allows you to choose on install whether or not you want to use MicroG, the open source alternative to Google Play services. Real World with MicroG is done with Signal, Briar, and Telegram, all from Aurora with GCM on, meaning they will be using GCM for background syncing. I also logged into a Google account through MicroG. Real World without MicroG used Signal and Briar from Aurora, where they both enabled their own background push notification service since there is no GCM or anything else to fall back on. And Telegram I had to get from F-Droid because the Aurora version didn't seem to fall back on its own push service. The max tests were done the same way as stock Android. CalyxOS with MicroG scored 12.25 hours max and 11.4 hours real world, which is a bit worse than stock Android. CalyxOS without MicroG scored just a tad under stock Android for the max test, and it scored a bit better than stock for the real world test. This was definitely the opposite of what I expected. It seems that at least these three apps run more efficiently using their own push service than either Google Play services on stock Android or MicroG on CalyxOS. As for why the max test did better on stock, I have absolutely no idea. This could be a margin of error. We're talking just a few minutes of a difference here. GrapheneOS is last, and this is just a single max and a single real-world test. The max test is the same as the others. As for the real-world test, it was set up the same way as CalyxOS without MicroG. Graphene scored 12.23 hours max and 11.23 hours real, which was the most surprising to me since I expected Graphene to be the best, especially in the max test, or at least equivalent to the others. I'm not quite sure why the Graphene battery doesn't quite stack up. This was all done on Android 10 for each ROM, everything was identical, so I'm not quite sure how to justify the numbers. I did not expect stock Android to do so well. It is possible some of these things could change in an idling test, though again, I think these values we got would proportionally correspond with idling, as the only difference between each ROM in terms of changes was how the apps function in the background and the presence of Google Play services, MicroG, or none of the above. It's possible that not only does Graphene perform the benchmark slower, but it might use more energy to do that for some reason. I'm not really sure. Frankly, the battery test is the benchmark I have the least amount of insight to, so it's all just speculation on my end. Just to finish this off, another big thing up for debate, which McKay has fought in the past, was Pixel 3a versus Pixel 3a XL battery life. I was originally under the impression that the 3a XL would give you better battery life since it has a larger battery and the same exact specs with the exception of the larger screen. McKay responded on Reddit saying this isn't necessarily the case because the larger screen needs more battery, which could, I guess, even things out or even make the XL last less time. So I did the max GrapheneOS test on the 3a XL, identical to the 3a Graphene max test. Keep in mind, this is helping McKay's hypothesis since this benchmark runs with the screen on the entire time at 50% brightness. Well, the 3a XL scored about 14 hours versus the 3a scored 12.23 hours, and this 3a XL benchmark blew everything else out of the water. So we can definitively say, even with the screen on, the 3a XL has better battery than the 3a, and this would likely only distance itself more when idling since the screen would be off and you're only reaping the benefits of the larger battery pack. So if battery is your largest concern, get the XL. Unfortunately, this benchmark does not exist on iOS, so I couldn't do a direct comparison. All I'll say is don't let the small battery pack on the iPhone fool you, because despite the league's better processing power, Apple still has fantastic battery optimization when the phone isn't doing something intensive. People online are showing 9+ hours of screen on time with their 2020 iPhone SE. And that, everybody, was the end of my testing. It's a lot to take in. Let me try and give you my overall thoughts. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the iPhone. Do not immediately put aside this option. There is a lot of misinformation about iPhones in the privacy and security world, most of which I consider conspiracy theories. People seem to think they have baked-in COVID tracing. This is false. You have to manually install a third-party app to do it. There's no evidence of Apple having backdoor access to anything related to this, or any other claims of Apple somehow secretly spying on your location, or all these other crazy claims without any evidence. I ask you, if you see these claims, to ask for direct evidence because they likely will supply none. From a security perspective, even McKay, the developer of Graphene, seems to think the iPhone is one of the most secure devices in the world, with one of the strongest security models. Aside from security, over in the privacy front, iOS 14 has really stepped up privacy against third-party applications, and Apple seems to continue to move down this path. Whether or not you like Apple, Apple is always ahead of Android on moving towards greater user privacy and security, and we should be grateful for that. The main drawback in my eyes for iOS is it's not open source, which again doesn't mean it's not secure and private. You can analyze an iPhone's traffic fairly easily, and after you disable the main gotchas in the settings, you can verify yourself that the iPhone won't be collecting secret data behind your back. The other big drawback to iOS, although you don't need an Apple account to use the phone, you will need one to download applications, and iOS doesn't offer an easy way to sideload apps or app stores unless you jailbreak, which breaks the security model of iOS. This alone is a reason for me never to buy an iPhone. However, this iPhone is $400, is going to have 6 years of software support versus the Pixel has about 3 years, so it's the same price for twice the length of support for much better hardware, especially performance-wise, and the most important thing, iOS will work with everything. If you have to use the Google Suite for your job, there's a good chance most of those apps won't work on GrapheneOS, but they are guaranteed to work on the iPhone. Pretty much everything is, and you can still have decent peace of mind on the iPhone from a security and privacy perspective. I really want to highlight that the iPhone is a valid option, and while I would never consider it, I totally understand why someone would, especially if you don't want to deal with custom ROMs and the fear of app compatibility on them. As for my challenge I brought up earlier, someone down below, leave me a phone that beats the iPhone SE in Geekbench, gets 6 years of software updates, has fantastic build quality, and beats the $400 price point. Nothing beats it, it just doesn't. The Pixel 4a is $50 cheaper, but likely won't get more than 3 years of software updates, and the performance will be dwarfed by the SE. So, even though I hate Apple, I gotta give them kudos here because I guarantee no one will win this challenge for the foreseeable future. Next, let's talk about Graphene. Graphene is going to trade blows with the iPhone on the security and privacy front from a technical perspective, which in itself is very impressive. If you use Graphene, I guarantee you'll just feel safe on it. The other major advantage to Graphene is you don't need any accounts for anything. There's no Google here. With F-Droid and Aurora, you can install all of your normal apps without needing a single account, and everything is open source. Even if iOS does beat Graphene in some regards in the privacy and security realm, I personally adore the fact you get to have that security and privacy on Graphene, all open source, without needing an account to get applications. However, Graphene does not directly have microG built in, as well as obviously Google Play services. This means a lot of apps won't work. McKay downplayed this on Twitter, and I was upset because we have a project called Plexus which shows and proves how many apps don't work on GrapheneOS. You will likely encounter some issues with compatibility if you move to Graphene, and if you're curious if you would, check out Plexus. That's what it's made for, and if you have some extra time, please contribute too so other people can know about the apps you have tried. A lot of apps don't have notifications, a lot of apps don't even open, and most apps that have maps built in won't load maps. These are huge sacrifices, and when you combine that with the noticeable speed differences on Graphene, I definitely would not make this my main recommendation to the average viewer on our channel. My guess is the average viewer is someone who cares about privacy but doesn't want to sacrifice a lot to get it. Maybe you still want to have a Discord account. Well, guess what? Discord doesn't get notifications on Graphene. That alone can be a deal breaker for someone. On the iPhone, everything will work, and the iPhone impressively enough has a lot of the perks of Graphene without the user realizing it. What Apple does really is remarkable. If you do Uber Eats, or if you're even a driver for Uber, you're not going to be able to have your job on GrapheneOS. So just keep that in the back of your mind. There are people who actually rely on these applications, and I don't think we should be downplaying how extreme it is to move to a phone that doesn't actually support most mainstream applications. It's a big move to make. And this is coming from someone who doesn't use any of these mainstream apps, and I am perfectly happy on Graphene. And again, for the record, I would never daily drive the iPhone. I personally despise iOS, but facts are facts, and the iPhone is impressive as much as I hate it. Now, for me personally, Graphene's compromises don't faze me. Again, I don't use my phone for really anything, so I couldn't care less if the 4 apps I use on a day-to-day basis take a bit longer to open. However, I'm a reviewer, and my job is to point out issues and offer advice based on those issues to my viewers, and I understand many of these compromises are too much for a lot of people. The last ROM is Calyx, and Calyx falls into a very tricky middle ground. Calyx gives you the option to use microG, if you choose to use it. It will offer much better compatibility than GrapheneOS. You can check Plexus and see side by side the differences in how many apps work better with microG. Calyx doesn't have any of the additional hardening found in GrapheneOS, it just maintains the Android security model, which is definitely not as strong as iOS in many regards. However, Calyx doesn't sacrifice performance or compatibility as much as Graphene does, while maintaining decent security and giving you a route to ditch Google's proprietary nonsense with Google Play services. Additionally, what I've noticed is while GrapheneOS has been rolling out a ton of under-the-hood security improvements to make the security model of the OS better, Calyx has been working on more user-oriented security features. Most notably, Calyx has taken the network permission from Graphene, which stops an app from ever accessing the internet in the settings, and they have improved on that by making it set to Wi-Fi only, cell only, background data versus foreground data, and enabling or disabling VPN data. There are many other smaller things like forcing devices connected to the phone's hotspot to route through a VPN, which normally doesn't happen. To go along with this, the Calyx devs have announced they're working on a tool that will be a firewall like NetGuard, which also bakes in an ad blocker, a VPN, a DNS changer, and a forced Tor connection, all into a single area, which would be huge because normally you can't combine NetGuard and a VPN and Tor, and you have to use separate tools, and a lot of times they don't play nicely together. That tool alone is incredibly attractive to me. My hope is that Graphene will get some of these features in the long run, and I do think this will eventually happen. And also vice versa, as some things Graphene does gets pushed upstream to AOSP, which finds its way into Calyx. It seems Calyx is much more focused on the usability perspective and offering a clean user experience and offering user tools for security and privacy, whereas Graphene is solely focused on the security model of the phone. Which takes us to our final words. My first recommendation to throw your way is to decide between iOS and Android. It's that simple. I'm sure most people already lean one way. If not, I don't know what to tell you, just keep listening. If you chose iOS, the iPhone SE is a total stud, or of course you can always get a more premium iPhone. If you want to go for Android and you're unsure between Calyx and Graphene, my recommendation, even though Graphene is not my main project to recommend to people because I consider it more extreme, I'd test Graphene first because you may be fine with its limitations, and if you are, you'll just benefit from its perks. So get Graphene first, don't spend hours setting it up, just use it casually before actually setting it up, get your main apps and see if it works for you first. If you realize, well, damn, everything I need works and I don't care about the other stuff, then you have a home and you can continue setting it up. If you get Graphene and realize, wow, almost nothing works and this sucks, I can't do this, just flash Calyx. You can reflash your phone as many times as you want, if the benchmarks in this video didn't prove that. On Calyx, try it out and see what you think. If it is still too extreme for you, then your only two options are stock Android or iOS, and I'd personally lean you towards iOS, but that's your decision. And I think that's all I have left to say. This video was a royal pain in the ass to do, and I'm sure it's going to be a bit controversial because no one seems to just admit valid faults in their projects. But the more we talk about them, the more we can improve them, and hopefully the better that'll make the projects at the end of the day. If you're a patron and supporting our work, first, huge thank you, but also I hope you got to see the behind the scenes of this video as I shared a lot of lenses where I was going through a lot of the testing. If you want to see behind the scenes like this in the future for our other content, as well as just support what we do, join our Patreon community. We're getting super close to hitting our $500 a month goal and our 100 patrons goal, so every person helps, even if it's $1 a month. We're dedicated to spreading privacy, and your contributions allow us to continue doing it, and we're just grateful to be here. What did you think of this video? I'm sure many people watching have used several of the operating systems talked about here, so what has been your experience? Definitely share and leave comments below. I'm interested what you all have to say, and I'm sure we're gonna get a lot of different opinions. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and see everybody next time.